The photograph that would unravel everything was snapped at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Venice. Lauren Sanchez wouldn't even know it existed until 3 months later, when it arrived inside a plain manila envelope. No return address, no explanation, just a single handwritten note. "You were never supposed to see this." When she pulled the picture free, her blood ran cold. It showed her wedding reception, but not from the perspective of any guest. The angle was high, unnatural, as if captured from a hidden camera mounted inside the glittering chandelier above the ballroom. But it wasn't the vantage point that made her stomach twist. It was the background. There, in the corner she couldn't see that night, from her seat at the head table, stood her new husband. Not laughing, not mingling, not celebrating, but locked in what looked like an urgent, almost conspiratorial conversation with a man she didn't recognize. Both of them weren't looking at each other. They were staring at her. While Lauren smiled, waving at guests, basking in what she thought was the happiest night of her life, two men in the shadows were watching, studying, calculating. And in that single frozen image, everything changed. They were strategists, power brokers, men and women whose names rarely appeared in headlines, but whose decisions shifted markets and rewrote destinies. 6 months before Lauren Sanchez walked down the aisle in Venice, these figures sat in a Manhattan skyscraper so polished it seemed to gleam against the night sky. The room was windowless, deliberately private. Laptops hummed quietly. Tablets glowed with graphs and figures worth billions.
They were strategists, power brokers, men and women whose names rarely appeared in headlines, but whose decisions shifted markets and rewrote destinies. 6 months before Lauren Sanchez walked down the aisle in Venice, these figures sat in a Manhattan skyscraper so polished it seemed to gleam against the night sky. The room was windowless, deliberately private. Laptops hummed quietly. Tablets glowed with graphs and figures worth billions. This was no rehearsal dinner. This was a contract negotiation masquerading as a boardroom war. And at the center of it, Jeff Bezos. Not the groom-to-be, not the man planning a love story to captivate the world, but the strategist, the operator. A billionaire preparing for a union that, to him, meant more than vows and champagne flutes. Because what Lauren believed was a wedding, others in that room viewed it as an alliance. No wedding planner could choreograph what was unfolding in Manhattan. These weren't florists or event coordinators. They were forensic accountants, private eyes, media tacticians, and lawyers who sold themselves as specialists in reputation management. The conference room looked out over Central Park, but nobody wasted a glance on the view. All eyes were fixed on a single manila folder sitting on the mahogany table's center, stamped with 2 words: Project Venice. Inside lay a 247-page dossier that would chill most readers. This was not a wedding itinerary. It was a meticulously engineered plan for a character assassination. Every element of what the world would call a romantic fete had been reverse designed to serve a darker agenda. The guest list read like an assets ledger. Not friends or relatives, but strategic players and potential witnesses. The venue wasn't picked for charm, but for surveillance advantages. Even the menu had been calibrated, chosen to keep guests talkative and alert, making conversations easier to capture via the hidden mics sewn into the palazzo. At the head of the table sat the man who'd pulled it all together, his face as unreadable as a grandmaster plotting the next move on a chessboard.
To the outside world, he appeared to be a groom preparing to wed the woman of his dreams. In truth,
He was architecting the most intricate snare modern romance had ever seen, not to expose a criminal, but to manufacture one. Phase 1, documentation, he said, his tone as detached as if he were briefing on quarterly profits rather than his own vows. Every glance, every word, every movement must be recorded and archived. She must believe she's building a new life, while in reality, she's constructing her own case file. The lawyers around the table quietly nodded, their styluses moving across tablets that would never be submitted in any official court. The investigators adjusted their earpieces, already mapping where hidden devices could be placed so seamlessly that only the installation technicians would ever notice them. The media operatives drafted glowing press statements, a smokescreen of fairy tale romance doubling as an evidence trail. Phase 2 begins the moment the ceremony ends, he continued, tapping to reveal architectural schematics of the Venetian palazzo on the wall display. 30 days of surveillance. She will call it a honeymoon. We will treat it as the most exhaustive background probe ever conducted on a civilian. One of the attorneys raised a hand cautiously. And the prenup? A thin smile curved at the corner of his mouth. That document, he said, won't simply shield my assets. It will build the legal scaffolding for her undoing. Every clause, he explained, was drafted not to keep her from taking wealth, but to ensure she would have no legal defense once their plan unfolded. Silence fell like a curtain over the room as the gravity of the strategy sank in. This was not a wedding being planned. It was a siege. And the intended target walked into the ceremony unaware she had already been attacked. Lauren's first inkling that something was amiss arrived during the chapter she'd been trained to expect, the fairy tale period after an engagement. The weeks that followed were dizzying. Magazine covers, couture fittings, invitation-only parties where she mixed with actors, moguls, and politicians she had once only seen on screens. Overnight, she had been recast, Cinderella in couture, flung into a world of private jets and limitless possibility.
But Cinderella's story never mentioned the odd, accumulating details of Lauren's new life. A personal shopper insisted on tagging along to every appointment, citing security. A social media manager materialized out of nowhere, explaining that someone of her status needed careful online stewardship. A nutritionist here, a trainer there, an image consultant with a friendly smile, each presented as a thoughtful gift from her fiancé, each insisting their services were essential to her new role. What Lauren did not understand was this: every generous offering came with invisible strings. The so-called gifts came with surveillance built in. The personal shopper logged every purchase, every offhand remark about price or taste, a running file on her habits. The social media manager gained control of her accounts, not merely to curate posts, but to map her network, who she followed, who followed her, and the hidden metadata behind every image. The nutritionist didn't only chart calories, he recorded how certain foods, conversations, and moments shifted her mood, slowly constructing a psychological dossier. Most dangerous of all was the trainer. He pushed her to the edge physically, then gently probed emotionally, prompting conversations about ex-lovers, family betrayals, and the fear of being unworthy of the life she suddenly led. Exhausted and searching for comfort, Lauren shared things she might otherwise have kept private, and every confession was being captured. The trainer's water bottle hiding a tiny recorder, each revelation becoming another line in a file meant to destroy her. What felt like care and guidance was actually careful engineering, a network of friendly faces gathering evidence under the guise of helping her adapt to a new world. Every word she shared was logged, then dissected by behavioral experts,
piecing together a detailed blueprint of her vulnerabilities. What was presented as joy, her glittering engagement party at a secluded Hamptons estate, was in reality the first field test of a surveillance operation. Beneath the surface glamour, cameras concealed in lighting fixtures and flower arrangements documented every movement, every whisper, every smile from a dozen vantage points. Lauren floated through the evening like royalty, glowing under the gaze of flashing cameras and congratulatory embraces. What she couldn't see was that the entire event had been orchestrated with precision. The guest list wasn't about nostalgia, it was strategy. Former friends were deliberately summoned to coax her into reminiscing and lowering her guard. Business contacts were included to watch how she carried herself under subtle pressure. Media figures were sprinkled into the crowd, baiting her into sound bites that could later be spliced and reframed. "She feels different," murmured one of her college friends, glass in hand, to another, "like she's always performing." The casual remark, spoken without a second thought, was instantly captured by a hidden microphone nestled in a bouquet. Weeks later, it would appear in a confidential dossier stamped Behavioral Observations, Social Integration Trial.
Within days, Lauren found herself utterly isolated, professionally, socially, and emotionally, struggling against an enemy that seemed to know her better than she knew herself. The final, most brutal truth hit her like a cold wind. Even the discovery of the surveillance had been staged. The anonymous envelopes, the photographs, the supposed proof of her husband's duplicity, none of it was accidental. It had been engineered. They wanted her to know she'd been played. The psychological blow of that realization was itself part of the punishment. The handwritten note tucked into the last envelope left no doubt. You were never meant to win. You were meant to be an example. The message was chillingly explicit. Every woman who imagines she can step into our world without permission will see what happens to you. Lauren understood then that her marriage had been less a union and more a showpiece, selected, manipulated, and weaponized to send a warning to anyone who might threaten the fragile architecture of power. She was not merely targeted for ruin, she had been cast as the villain in a larger drama engineered to preserve impunity at the top. Sitting in an emptied penthouse, her accounts frozen and her name shredded across headlines, the photograph that first sparked her doubts suddenly seemed small against the scale of the conspiracy. It was not the beginning of her story so much as a single thread in a web that reached far beyond her personal collapse. She hadn't simply been abandoned, she had been offered up as a sacrifice to safeguard an empire. Those two words her husband had whispered in Venice, too late, were never about the death of their love. They were a verdict, a signal that her destiny had been written long before she believed she was in love. And now, in the stillness of her empty penthouse, the truth settled with merciless clarity. She had never truly been a bride. She had been a piece of evidence, a living exhibit in a trial where the outcome was predetermined. The judgment had been delivered before the case had even begun. That photograph would become Lauren's only proof that her marriage had been less a union of love and more a meticulously staged deception. But the evidence reached her too late. By the time it landed in her hands, the trap had already been sprung, and the machinery of her downfall was grinding forward with ruthless precision. The attack unfolded in carefully engineered waves. The first was legal. Lawsuits erupted in New York, California, and London within days of each other, each alleging a different form of misconduct. Their true purpose was not justice, but paralysis, designed to freeze her accounts, strip her liquidity, and drown her in a sea of filings and depositions. The prenuptial agreement she had signed in a haze of champagne and flowers now revealed its cruelest edge. She was liable for legal fees on both sides. Every motion filed, every hearing delayed, every page of discovery pulled her further into financial ruin. The second wave was social. Even before the ink dried on court documents, headlines began to appear. Carefully planted leaks slithered into tabloids and digital feeds. Clips of private moments, edited, distorted, stripped of context,
portrayed her as conniving, manipulative, hungry for status. Conversations once whispered in confidence with friends were recast as evidence of ingratitude and scheming. Even her philanthropy, once her proudest pursuit, was reframed as nothing more than a calculated bid for relevance. By the time Lauren realized what was happening, the storm was already everywhere. Legal, financial, social, swallowing her life in coordinated waves. The third wave hit Lauren's career like a planned blitz. Contacts vanished overnight. Projects she'd nurtured were quietly shelved. Agents who once courted her stopped answering calls. Her professional life, which had been building momentum, collapsed into silence within 48 hours. Online, the assault intensified. Accounts that had been managed by her husband's team were suddenly overrun with vitriol, seemingly organic outrage that, on inspection, proved to be a coordinated army of bots engineered to shred her reputation. Social media, once a platform for her voice, became a battlefield where every post invited a storm of abuse. Isolation set in quickly. Friends who had toasted her happiness edged away, some convinced by the damaging narratives, others afraid the association would taint their own standing. Anonymous packages bearing evidence of wrongdoing began arriving at family homes, seeding doubt even among those closest to her. The most devastating betrayal, however, was intimacy turned into surveillance. Calls to lawyers were monitored. Strategies she discussed in confidence were somehow anticipated and neutralized before she could act. Every legal maneuver she tried to mount was met with a countermove already in place. Potential allies were quietly contacted and warned off, leaving her to fight a war against opponents who could see every step she took while she remained blind to their playbook.
The analysts logged their findings with clinical detachment. Lauren was showing signs of self-consciousness, they wrote. In truth, she was simply adjusting to a new life under a microscope. But within their reports, ordinary adaptation became coded as deceptive behavior. Each natural hesitation, every pause before answering, every flicker of doubt was reframed as suspicious. Evidence for a prosecution that didn't yet exist, but was being assembled piece by piece. 3 days before the wedding, while her mind spun with dress fittings, seating charts, and press interviews, the final trap was sprung. The prenuptial agreement arrived. Its timing was as deliberate as its contents. She was emotionally exhausted, her guard down, her focus on survival rather than scrutiny. The attorneys knew she wouldn't have the clarity or courage to push back. What she signed was no ordinary prenup. The document stretched 87 pages, a labyrinth of dense legal jargon crafted to disguise its true intent. Buried deep within the clauses was not protection of assets, but the codification of control. Silence clauses that bound her tongue, forbidding her from speaking publicly about their life. Image clauses granting him absolute authority over how she could be portrayed to the world. Financial clauses designed to strip her of everything if she ever dared oppose him. On the surface, she had secured her future as the wife of the richest man alive. In reality, she had signed away her freedom. Perhaps the most sinister of all were the so-called behavior clauses. Crafted in language so deliberately vague, they turned life itself into a minefield. A casual conversation with the wrong person, visiting a place deemed inappropriate, even voicing an opinion that strayed from the script, all of it could be twisted into grounds for punishment. And punishment, here, wasn't just financial ruin. It meant exile, humiliation, the enforced isolation of being blacklisted by an invisible network of power brokers loyal to him. Lauren signed it without hesitation, seated in her bridal suite, roses filling the air with perfume, champagne flutes glittering like promises. To her, it felt like the last formality before stepping into a dream. In truth, she was sealing her fate with her own hand, endorsing a document that had been engineered to look inevitable, airtight, inescapable. Venice had never been about romance. Its canals and palazzos were chosen not for beauty, but for control. The historic palace hosting the ceremony
had quietly changed hands 6 months earlier, purchased through layers of shell companies. That secret gave his technical team free rein to transform it into a fortress of observation. Light fixtures doubled as cameras, artwork disguised pinhole lenses, ornamental moldings concealed sensors. The entire building was alive, breathing surveillance into every corner. Directional microphones so precise they could capture whispers across a crowded ballroom were embedded in chandeliers and sconces. Beneath the palazzo's centuries-old stones, a labyrinth of fiber-optic cables pulsed like veins, all feeding into a hidden control center deep in the renovated wine cellar. There, behind locked doors, operators would track every movement, every laugh, every secret uttered between clinking glasses. And the 300 guests? They were not simply friends, relatives, or dignitaries. They were unwitting players in a theater of control. Each chosen for a reason, each role scripted in advance.
They were unwitting players in a vast psychological experiment. Celebrities distracted the press with glamour and fashion, ensuring headlines skimmed the surface, while hidden cameras recorded every subtle cue. Politicians and corporate titans were planted as living endorsements, their mere presence lending credibility to whatever story would later be told. Close friends and family were strategically seated to provoke emotional reactions from Lauren, moments that could be captured, time-stamped, and analyzed. The ceremony itself was executed with surgical precision. Lauren's position at the altar had been chosen to maximize visibility to the web of recording devices. The officiant, selected for gravitas, was actually chosen because his vocal patterns wouldn't interfere with the directional mic's ability to isolate nearby conversations. Even the playlist was engineered not for romance, but for acoustics. Songs whose frequencies masked the imperceptible hum of concealed recorders. As Lauren glided down the aisle in her bespoke gown, believing she was stepping into a storybook moment, she was instead moving through the most thoroughly documented ceremony in memory. Every step, every practiced smile, every tear was captured from dozens of hidden angles and routed to secure servers. That footage would not memorialize a wedding. It would become a dossier, a curated body of evidence assembled long before anyone suspected what the celebration really was. The reception was where the evening's true design quietly unfolded, though only those in on the secret would recognize it. The seating chart, dressed up as elegance in symmetry, was in fact a surveillance grid. Lauren's dearest friends and family were placed at tables wired with the most advanced microphones. Their every memory, every whispered remark about her past, her character, her relationships, captured with forensic precision. Business associates were seated strategically as well. Their conversations about her competence and ambition harvested for future use, ammunition that could one day be turned against her. The rituals of joy, dancing, champagne toasts, the ceremonial cutting of the cake were staged against a backdrop of espionage so sophisticated it could have rivaled the playbook of a government intelligence agency. Lauren drifted through the evening, radiant, smiling for photographs, believing she was living a fairy tale. Unaware, she was instead furnishing the raw material for her own undoing. And then the image, the photograph that would shatter her illusions months later. Her husband, tucked away in the shadows, locked in a discreet but urgent exchange with a stranger, documents glowing on a tablet between them, both men watching her as she laughed at the head table. That frame came from one of dozens of hidden cameras she never knew existed. But unlike the rest, this photo was never meant to leave the palazzo. Somehow,
through defiance or accident, someone, perhaps a technician with a conscience, perhaps a guard who saw too much, preserved it, smuggled it out, allowed it to survive.